we shall begin the session now. I'm Chitranjali Tiwari, and I'm the Associate Fellow at the Center for Policy Studies at J.K. Lakshmipeth University. And it gives me immense pleasure to announce the third session of our speaker series, Impact Talks. And this session is on people, opinions, and public policy by Mr. Simran Grover. For those of you who are new to our series, I'll quickly introduce this platform where we invite experts who have contributed significantly towards the policy and development sector through their exemplary work and research. I would like to welcome Simran to be a part of this discussion today. Simran Grover is an energy professional with more than 12 years of experience across oil and gas, renewables, and power distribution. His professional journey across corporate and social development domains has resulted in the creation of Basque Research, a human-centric organization striving energy equity and climate change. Today, in this interactive session by Mr. Grover, he will share with us the real dimensions of public policy and governance, and he'll use the case studies and experience from his work at Basque Research. I also request the audience, before we start with the session today, to kindly switch on their videos because Mr. Grover has promised this to be an interactive session. Please participate, ask your questions, and be an active listener during this discussion today. So I hand over to Mr. Grover now to start with the session, and yeah, thank you.
Right. Thank you, Chitranjali. Thank you for inviting me. As Chitranjali mentioned, the session, is going to be an exploration. I am not a public policy professional by academic training, more of an accidental public policy professional, and I'd like to share, my exploration of the domain and what I understand, and hopefully, go back with some validation from your end also that I am on the right track. But more importantly, together, I think we need to have this consciousness how important public policy can be for citizens in general, but the most marginalized among us, whom we often ignore. So as Chitranjali requested, I like as many of you possible to switch on your videos, unless they are technical domains, of course, that's acceptable. I'm not going to offer anything so inspirational that's going to change your world. If that's what you're looking for, I'm sure there are better content on YouTube, right? But before I start, at least let's have a quick round of, introduction of those at least who are on the panel. And please share also sort of a general background of your family, which geography, etc. you are coming from. That will, help make the discussion that's going to happen a little bit richer. Thank you. Anybody who can start. Usha, I can see next to mine. Quickly, let's do it very quickly. No inhibitions.
Everyone, I think you already know me a little bit because I think you saw my resume already, and I live in Vizag now, and before I'm doing computational social science. I'm going to be doing computational social science. And this year we're doing analytics and research. And before this, I had a food business here, and then I did marketing, like you already know. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you. So we have some flavor from the South.
Abhijit, you want to start?
Yeah, hi, I'm Abhijit. I'm based in Mumbai, and my background is in computer engineering. But then I've worked in a data science startup for about 3 years. Here I'm kind of switching over to like data analytics, computational social science over the next 1.5 years. And yeah, that's about it.
Thank you, Abhijit. Who's next?
Dyuti?
So hi, I'm Dyuti. I'm currently based in Udaipur. I did my undergrad from FLAME as economics as my major and public policy as my minor. And right now the course I'm doing is, so I'm enrolled in the resource economics program in the college.
Great. I spent 8 years in Udaipur before I started BASC, a beautiful city.
Hi, Dr. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm
Dr.
Mahima. I'm
Mahima.
based in Bangalore. My background is in economics. Yeah, and I'm currently doing the postgraduate course at JKLU and hopefully my master's in public policy. Yeah, that's about it.
Thank you, Mahima.
Dr. Sarita, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, definitely, Chitranjali. Hi, greetings everyone. This is Dr. Sarita Gupta. I am the assistant professor in the Institute of Management, and in teaching, I am approx for 10 years. So I'm working in the area of accounting and finance, and having a lots of interest in these sessions too, and hope that today's session will be of lots of learning for everyone.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Dr. Sarita.
And Dr. Naidu, would you like to introduce yourself? Yeah. So.
Hi, good morning. Here it's good morning. I am currently in North America. Good evening, everybody. I am Dr. Prakash Naidu, and I have a different type of experiences, global experience. So I have worked in India, and I was heading robotics and artificial intelligence when I was in DRDO. And currently I'm Dean of Research and Development at JKLU from last 2 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Naidu. Pleasure meeting you. I think then we can move on. As Chitranjali introduced myself, Simran Grover. I founded BASC Research about, I think, 2.5-3 years back. Before that, I was working as a social entrepreneur, providing rural energy accessible solutions in unelectrified villages across Rajasthan and UP, not limited just to households, but also for various applications, including livelihoods, education, health, etc. BASC Research was a very, very instinctive venture. There was, some gap that I visualized, which I thought, public policy is the domain, and took the jump. And from there, and my understanding of the power sector is still continuing to evolve. The challenges continue to evolve. As Chitranjali also shared, we are a human-centric organization. Now, what that really means, we'll try to explore that, working on energy issues as well as climate issues, right? To begin with, I'll just put a small question to my colleagues here. As per your understanding, why public policy is important? Very quickly, 1 or 2 people. It doesn't have to be a brilliant answer. I'm going to call names if people don't respond.
Public policy just helps in addressing the major issues or pertinent issues that are there in the economy. And yeah, so it just helps in, I'm just trying to frame it, but yeah, it helps in addressing those issues in the economy, 1 point, and then I'll think over for something else. I'll just frame my answer and get back then.
Right.
I want to say something. Sorry. Hi, my name is Apala. Very extremely sorry. My internet connection is not strong enough to support a video setting. So first of all, this is like a much debated topic if public policy actually is capable of solving problems. Researchers call the wicked problems as such, as they are known, climate change and all the bigger issues, health, water. They have not been solved by public policy. But in my opinion, public policy is important in the sense that it brings together government, researchers, policymakers in a setting which allows them to explore different options for giving some kind of a solution. But I don't think they have, I'm not confident about if those solutions are real solutions in the sense they end up solving the problems that exist.
Thank you, Para. A very interesting perspective. is public policy there to solve problems or solutions? I guess most practitioners do think that they have the solution. It's just the stakeholders who are not being aligning, and hence, things are not happening. Offer the blames lying with government. Yes, very, very, very accurate. As per my understanding, for me, public policy is very, very important because it deals with people, right? Just for example, farm laws, now we can debate whether they are right or wrong, good or bad for the country. But one legislation passed over a day, thousands of people are on the ground, struggling in close to zero degree temperatures in very difficult conditions. And not just that, every farmer in the world, in the country will be affected. Whether positively or negatively is yet to be seen, right? Similarly, if we look at right to education, it completely changed, have a significant impact on the structure, how education was being imparted, right? Again, universal education, are there outcomes there? As Apala mentioned, did it solve the problems? If our reports are to be looked at, far from it, right? So that I think is a common ground, the very foundation of public policy, where it deals with people. Now there are challenges with people, right? There are huge challenges of working with the people, and we try to explore that. Another two ways that organizations and people work with people or for people. And I'll put it simply, objectively, as working for people and working with people, right? Could anybody reflect on what's the difference between the two, working with the people and working for the people? Anybody who's worked on the social development sector before?
So I'm currently working on a paper which talks about participatory planning. I think working with the people involves a lot of participation of people, and there are many theories of participatory planning already in place, which talk about, so there's one famous theory which talks about 7 ladders of participatory planning. And from the first step is basically where you involve people in the problem narrative itself. And the last stage would be when people are working, they identify the problem and they also work towards it and they finally solve it. So I think that's working with the people, and working for the people would not involve, it wouldn't have so much participation or involvement of people around. That's very literally speaking.
Right. Yes. Technically speaking, participatory planning does add an objective dimension to these statements. Again, from my understanding, especially not just working with vast research, but working with various social organizations, as people from privilege, as people who are educated, as professionals coming on the ground, we think we have the solutions, right? And we try to create plans and Excels and God knows what, indicators for development, etc., and try to implement solutions on the ground. There is a hierarchy behind it. There's a structure behind it, which is very corporate in nature. While I was working in clean energy sector, we used to say, the flavor of investments or the donation trends, philanthropic trends change every year. One year it's clean energy, other year it's cooking, third year it's menstruation, fourth year is maternal health, etc. But this again, as Apala mentioned, these problems don't get solved, right? We are jumping from one space to another without addressing any of the fundamental issues. Now, working with public policy for me, as as a founder of BAST Research, one of the greatest responsibility I feel, or the challenge I feel, is that I really don't understand the people I'm working with, right? There's a diversity of people. We are not connected with everybody, right? There's an obvious urban-rural divide. There is various segment of consumers which are defined by, let's say, tariff structures. We have industrial consumers, we have mixed load consumers, we have domestic consumers of various categories, various income centiles. At the end of the day, our responsibility also lies to the most marginalized. And we really don't understand, how they are going to be impacted by the work we are doing. Or often the, our intentions might be great. As Apala mentioned, there are no solutions, which also is basically public policy has often have unintended consequences, right? The farm strikes, for example, could be defined as unintended consequences of a public policy decision of the government, right? Therein lies the bigger challenge, right? And hence, I'm not saying that we are yet there, but what we try to do is try to develop an ecosystem working with the people, right? And what for me it means is that we create an ecosystem, number one, where we can really understand the challenges of the people, the aspirations of the people, vulnerabilities of the people. It also means that we're trying to create an ecosystem where people are empowered to solve their own problems, represent their own problems, right? I, sitting in Jaipur, cannot understand what 9 hours of power cut in a tribal village in Kotra would mean for the female in the family, for the maid in the family, for the kids in the family, right? Again, if you're talking about agriculture, farmers getting poor supply, their equipment getting damaged. For public policy professionals sitting in the city making decisions, we don't often realize the challenges and impacts is happening on the people on the ground. I'll give you a very objective example of a very well recent appreciated notification of Ministry of Power. So about 2 weeks back, they released something called the Rights of Electricity Consumer Rules 2020, right? Great rules to begin with. I mean, there are a lot of provisions which are to the advantage of general consumers. But one of the provisions basically deals with the grievance redressal. Now, grievance redressal basically means if I, as an electricity consumer, have a problem, then what is the mechanism through which I can address that problem, right? Very simply speaking. Now, the structure that they're proposing is that at zonal level, at division level, subdivision level, which is the typical hierarchy of the electricity distribution companies, there will be forums. These are called grievance redressal forums, which will be typically has 3 members, and these 3 members will be representative of distribution companies, right? Now, what is the challenge here, right? Can anybody look into it? Sounds like a fairly good mechanism of objectively from for example, subdivision level is very, if I'm living in a village, is very close to my home, right? I can go there and address my problem and things should be fine.
I mean, I first of all don't understand, like, in what sense are you talking about challenges? Like, is it only challenges like you're saying at a sub-district level, or like, can you just clarify the question a little? Sorry.
Sure. I will like you to put yourself in the feet of a poor rural consumer who is uneducated, likely uneducated, or at least does not have the confidence that you or I may have, right? Does not have access to information like you or I may have, right? Now, if I have a technical issue or any issue related to, let's say, my electricity bill, I typically pay 500 rupees. Suddenly, my bill has come out to be 5,000 rupees. and which is a very common and prevalent problem at the grassroots. Now, my first approach will be to the distribution company official responsible for my area. It will be either a junior engineer or a AEN or an XEN whom I approach. And this anomaly will extend to lot other services, including banking and healthcare, etc. So let's be conscious of that. Now, our typical experience dealing with government officials, even of the let's say the so-called better privileged middle class people who are educated, is extremely bad, right? Now let's consider what's the treatment that a poor electricity consumer gets from the official, right? Very poor, indignifying in many manners. Can we, do you all agree to that? Is that a typical possibility?
Yes.
I'm not saying all officials are bad, but that's a typical possibility, right? Now, what this frameworks of Ministry of Power is basically suggesting, right? If that official does not address your complaint, you will go to a bench of 3 officials, right, who are the same part of the same organization, and possibly will include also the same officials who have already disappointed you, harassed you, and treated you in an undignified manner, right? Indignity, I believe, and I've seen for myself, is an instrument of exclusion of the marginalized, right? People are afraid to go and ask a bank manager for a loan, and they will rather pay 5% a month interest to 10% a month interest to a money lender than go to a bank manager and hear his abuses. And same principle applies to asking for rights for services from a distribution utility, right? So this is this typical example how when it comes to public policy design, we treat all people as equal. What I'm trying to emphasize is that people have different vulnerabilities, and it's a challenging aspect for us to understand their vulnerability, and hence as public policy professional, we need to be very conscious of that. There are different kinds of public policy professionals, and if you if you choose to go into the domain, you could be a consultant or working in the consulting organization or to the government. You could be working as a research organization. Even in research organization, there are different flavors of practitioners. Often people are masked as consultants rather than advocates for people. On the other extreme, there are human rights activists, etc. So we need to be very conscious of, I believe, what we want to be and what we want to achieve, right? If it's a career for certain goals for yourself, great. But if you're working for the people, then the level of consciousness, the level of subjective understanding and not just subjective understanding has to be a lot more.
So, Simran, I would like to add to what you are telling, because you told the example of this electrical complaint, so to say. So, I will give an example, and then I have some questions too related to that. We have a small farm, so about 15 acres. So there is a provision for, and the farm was very remote. It was about 2 to 3 kilometers away from the nearest electrical point. So in Karnataka, it's near about 60 kilometers away from Bangalore. So there is a provision that if you are a farmer and your land doesn't have electrical connection, then you can apply, actually, because there's something called agricultural electricity, as it's a policy of government all over India, that agricultural electricity is free, but it is allowed only to use for agricultural purpose. And you should get it within about a month, the electrical connection, no matter where you are, provided it is sort of reasonable to reach that location. So we were in exactly 3 kilometers away, right? So it is within the range, and they are supposed to give within 1 month. Now they didn't give. Like obviously, we all have bad experiences with government machinery, and they didn't give. So it took almost about 2 years. So to make the journey short, like when we are talking about policy, there can be a policy, but the implementation of that may not be done in a way government intended. So there are a lot of people, a lot of factors. Then they told that, like again and again, the engineer was telling that, okay, why don't you get it done through a contractor? So the policy, the public policy, if you can say it so, because we're talking about policy. So policy can have several type of provisions. Like there's a contractor provision, which is fast track, you will get within 10 days. So we were seeing around the neighborhood that everybody was telling that you have to pay 3 lakhs to the contractor and you have to get it done. But if you get it done through them, then you have to pay. But the track, you can call it, then again, my question is policy and legislation. Like what is the difference between the two? Because we understand that policy is before a legislation is made, or maybe a complementary to legislation, right? It's a policy is broader than legislation or rules. So the government rules are one thing, implementation is another thing. So what happened is that we had to go to like what you are telling, like there was a rule brought that if there's a complaint, like what you are telling, a bench or some sort of panel. Similar to that, there was a rule here that the executive engineer of the entire region will come to the local office once in 15 days to listen to the public complaints. So that also we did, and that we experienced that although we complained and he told written complaint and he asked to do the action. So the intentions are all good, and but nothing happening. Then again, we go to about 30 kilometers away. So this is what people typically have this experience of running around the government office, right? So looking at it as a case, what we experienced after 2.5, 3 years without paying any money, but finally we had to pay some 20,000 as some sort of, the right, office expenses or whatever we call it. But look at 3.5 lakhs and 20,000, there's a lot of difference. And for poor farmer, like we are well-to-do, and people were telling why you are running around, your time is precious. And sometimes I had to go from Jaipur to whenever I was going for a holiday to Bangalore to attend to this. So people will say the shortcut method, like, okay, you pay off and you do the second track, because all these government policies have a easy option also. So here, what we experienced is that one is implementation, and I'm sure that all of us in the panel may be knowing that if we have an experience like this, some youngsters may not have the experience, but their parents may be having. So public policy is one thing, like right to information also. You mentioned about right to information, right to education. So in right to education, when you really go, then they will have a test for the kids, something they will do so that the poor child will not get admitted, right? So policies are in place. How the implementation can be improved? Can implementation be part of the policy in a way that it can be implementable and implemented properly? That is one question I have. Another question, like, I don't know, like, because you told interactive, so these are typically at the end of the session, but I think it's...
No, please. This is great.
To interrupt. And the second part is that the policy will have sort of loopholes generally. So how do we anticipate and avoid the pitfalls in a policy? For example, why the farmer, you told the example of farmer agitation, right? Okay, it can be political, like, because whatever government does, it is wrong. So opposition will always jump in and mobilize to oppose it. Whether it is a good policy or bad policy, it's very difficult to say, as you are telling. But the apprehension, like you told, for and with the farmer. So maybe you discuss with farmers, but always there will be political parties and opposition who will instigate the farmers to do something in reverse, right? So there, how do you bring consensus in policy making? So I'm asking several questions, but let me rephrase the 3 questions. So one is the implementation part. Another is how to avoid the pitfalls and loopholes. so that the policy becomes really useful and implemented. So unless you have punitive action, like some sort of penalty not to admit a poor child, it's not going to happen, because the schools are all private in India and they are going to want to admit only rich kids who will give money, right? And other people don't want to mix with these poor kids. So, and regarding the farmer, you told with the policy formation, so suppose they have in the Western countries, for example, I have spent a lot of time in the US and Canada, particularly in Canada, because I saw the difference between US and Canada also. In Canada, they have this fancy for lot of meetings and lot of public, like they will have this town hall meeting type of thing, in which they will ask the parents, or if it is a school related issue, to come and speak. And but we, at some point of time, you come to know that they have already decided to do it, and it's like a show. They are putting up a show to ask your opinion. So they want to show that public policy was made by a lot of meetings, but eventually actually government has decided something and it will be implemented. So consensus building. So these 3 points, what is your take? Maybe you need not answer all of them, but in the next 1 hour, whenever the meeting lasts, and whenever maybe some of that you are going to cover. So it's just a interruption. Like I just wanted to put these 3 points there.
Thank you, Dr. Naidu. I don't think I have the answer to all of them. These are all difficult questions, right? But let's very valid questions indeed. And let me share my understanding of the issues, right? To begin with, structurally, I think we have the Constitution at the top, and from the Constitution, we derive our legislations. Legislations have to comply with the directives and the other provisions, including fundamental rights given in the constitutions. And these legislations are very broad in nature, typically, right? And from legislations, we have, then policies, which are policies, notifications, rules, and the regulatory bodies which come out with regulations, etc. So that's the typical structure, the technical structure that is there. So again, I think what we need to understand is that there are structural issues in the society, right? Or let me just put it like this: in my understanding, there are structural issues in the society, and often the policies, and when I say policies, it includes pretty much everything, legislations, rules, etc., and the implementation of it also, right? Are there to maintain the status quo, number one, right? For example, I'll give you an example. So the Indian government basically announced that mandate that we are going to be free of sanitation workers who are cleaning who are manually cleaning the toilets, right, with their hands. We are going to be free of them. And we had a session with Mr. Bezwada, who works for rights of sanitation workers. And so a complex issue. I mean, sanitation workers, if you look at them, they work for paltry wages, which are often less than even wages, minimum wages defined by the government. So how do people get out of that? So government, municipalities don't hire people, they hire contractors. Now contractors hire people at whatever salaries they want, right? So there are always loopholes. Government on the paper will never recognize that there are, sanitation workers who are cleaning sewage, etc., by their hands. But obviously there are also human rights workers who bring this issue to the forefront, right? They wanted to announce this year that India is free of sanitation workers which are cleaning, manual sanitation and cleaning, and the the path that they've dotted at, rather than rehabilitating, providing them livelihood opportunities, what they were trying to do was, give us a list of toilets and all the sites that are there, and we will destroy those toilets. The workers themselves were harassed by the police that if you continue this job, you're going to put them jail, right? Now, these people are working in those unfortunate domain because of very, very limitations, of course, right? Nobody wants to be cleaning sewage, cleaning human excretas by hand, and that also for anywhere between, let's say, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 rupees a month, right? That kind of livelihood is basically there to ensure that you are perpetually, for generations, in extreme poverty, right? So, and this is just one extreme example. There are structural issues, there are class issues, which exist all around us, right? And another fundamental issue is the decentralization of power. Becomes a very wide subject domain. But even if you look at, let's say, our panchayats, so we have, on paper, we have a very decentralized governance system, which is in the form of, village panchayats. But at the end of the day, if you see the power of the panchayats in terms of, doing their own planning of development, the funds are decided by the center and the state. They're released by that for specific projects from the top, right? The people or even the representative, elected representatives of the panchayat offices have very, very limited power in doing their own planning. There has been minimal efforts, essentially not by the government, to empower them to do their own decentralized planning. So the issues are many. I mean, I think it will be very difficult to address those issues. I'm not sure if I answered any of you. So implementation can be improved. Yes, it can be. I mean, again, we are, so for example, BAST Research itself is working largely on implementation of policies. We have regulations which are there to safeguard rights of consumers, etc. But there's no governance structure around it. There's no monitoring on how it's being implemented. So our role as consumer advocates, as protector of consumer rights, is to work, is to throw light on what's really happening on the ground. And the way we do it is, collaborate with various people, like-minded people on the ground, build instruments which can objectively collect data and show the regulatory agencies, organizations, what is happening on the ground. I'll just give you an example, and it's a continuous struggle. BAST Research is a very small organization, and a sector is a $1 billion, $1 trillion sector with very, very vested interests, right? But I think as people become more aware, the governance will also improve. And the challenge is then not, how we can improve the people, not how we can improve the policy implementation. I think the bigger and the deeper challenge is how can we make people more participative, more conscious, and hence, demand more responsiveness for governance institutions, right? So that's, and it's a continuous struggle. It's not gonna, no brilliant policy, no technology is going to solve that. And I'm coming from a technical background and being very fond of technology. I have this growing aversion for technology. I'm not against the technology, but growing aversion for technology in solving public issues, right? Again, I'll share you an example of what's happening in the distribution sector. Smart meters, I'm sure you have heard of it many times, are being pushed by the government and are being, positioned as the magic wand which are going to solve the problems of the distribution companies. Now, the fact of the matter is, we have come across significant consumers on the ground where meter gets damaged and doesn't get replaced for months and years, even when they complain, right? Now, there are also cases, of course, where meters are not allowed to replaced because, people don't want to, because and let's say people don't want to because they want to steal electricity or other reasons, and there's a nexus on the ground. Nothing happens without the support of DISCOM officials on the ground. We came with and from analog meters to digital meters to spot billing. On the ground, if you see, people are billing and metering is just not happening. People get bills based on basis of average billing, which basically means some contractor is sitting in his room and coming up with numbers based on which bill is generated. And after 1 year, when you have to tally your meters for accounting purposes, his person goes, and there are many cases where the arrears get aggregated over the year, over 6 months and 12 months, and people end up with huge bills, 5,000 rupees, 10,000 rupees. If my income is 3,000 rupees, and which is very variable, or 5,000 rupees, which is very seasonal, I might not have the money to pay the bill that month, right? In extreme cases, it's also a cause of disconnection of electricity. People have ended with bills of 20,000 rupees, 50,000 bill when their average billing is 500 rupees, 700 rupees. So the fundamental issues of people's of the employee capacity on the ground, of the governance, etc., even governance within the institution is not being handled. We are looking at solutions from my side. The management of the distribution company is not independent to make decisions. If they don't comply with the government, the MD of the DISCOM may be checked out next week, right? Same goes for energy secretary. And your transfers, your promotions are happening basis of favor and not basis of your capability or your competency. So various fundamental issues which definitely technology is not going to solve, and hence the only way forward is building a more conscious and demanding group of citizens which can take the stand and demand for better implementation of policies of whatever domain, right? So that's the point, the action, the plan of action that we choose to pursue, using data, using evidence from the ground, from the last mile, and taking to the regulatory platforms, taking into the judicial platforms, and demanding for the implementation of policy, right? It's government of India often comes up with great policy, constitution, and we can debate. Constitution of India is probably one of the best in the world, no doubts about that. Our laws and legislation are often great. Loopholes are obviously there, and they are not definitive in nature, often because the definition also evolves over the period of time. But again, it's the implementation where those policies really fail. So I'll stop at that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. But
I'm not sure if that answered anything.
Yeah.
Simran, sorry to interrupt you, but I want to add one more thing. Particularly in power sector, majority of the customers suffers because there are lots of evasion of electricity in some areas where designated people are not able to stop that evasions of electricity. That's why the end burden shifts on the ultimate consumers. That's why their average billing is high. So that is also one major issue.
Thank you, Dr. Sarita. I will. That's definitely an issue. We need to understand why that issue is there, right? That's the whole, I think, focus of the discussion that I'm trying to push. I'll shortly come after that. And I think this provides me the linking point to my next next subject, which is opinions, right? Opinions, or we can also say biases, and there's a very thin line between them. Before I answer Dr. Sarita's questions, if people can give me quick input, you know, how our opinions and or biases, if you want to put it, are shaped, right? Biases are there if you become conscious of them, otherwise they are just opinions. Dr. Sarita, your voice is breaking. Okay, somebody else?
Can I?
I
Okay,
mean,
I'll-
like,
okay, fine.
sorry, you go first. Sorry.
You go for go ahead.
Okay, very briefly. It's more like if when you start talking about prejudices, biases, and all these opinions and stuff, it's largely a question of nature versus nurture. Like, is it the environment you grew up in? Was it something inherent, like that you would already hate a certain class of people, or is it something inbuilt, or is something that comes from external experiences, or just the environment you grew up in? Like, that's my opinion. Yeah.
Thank you. Valid point. Often ignored. People don't realize that they carry certain biases and opinions based on the family they were born or the region they were born. Chitranji, you want to come in?
Through information tools like media or education also can be a good information tool. So both of these.
Right. So I think that's pretty much sums it up. The environment and the information, right? Environment. Basically, I'll put it this: you know, every interaction is shaping our opinion, right? Some interactions are consciously and some subconsciously. We are brought in certain family born with a certain religion, and we, you know, grow up having certain inclinations. I believe in the Sikhism philosophy. I am, by the way, an agnostic by choice. But let's say if I'm a religious fellow, you know, I would have believed in Sikhism philosophy and would fight for it. I definitely grew up with a very strong idea of patriotism, thanks to my education, the schooling, the Rashtragan that we sang every day in the morning prayer, right? And henceforth, right, we have opinions on how market should be, how education should be, how health should be. Obviously, they get built consciously when we are exposing ourselves to information, right? And again, that exposure to information can be intended and non-intended, right? Especially in the era of social media. And as public policy professionals, herein lies another challenge, right? Are we really conscious of our biases, not opinions, but of course everybody has opinion, but are we really conscious of our biases? I'll start with Dr. Sarita's question, point she raised, that people are evading paying for electricity. Electricity theft, of course, is a huge problem in India and Rajasthan, of course. The general understanding is it's the poor who steals, who doesn't pay. But let me clarify that if you go to Bhilwara, which is the industrial area, or the Bhiwadi, which are the industrial areas, theft of electricity is much more rampant, right? Now, a poor household which is having electricity bulb and let's say a fan or two will probably consume less than 30 units of electricity. And if it doesn't pay it, it's 180 rupees to the exchequer, roughly speaking. 180 rupees, that's it, 250 rupees. Bhiwadi, let's say if a big industrial plant, they've done tampering with the meter, which is reducing their how fast the meter is moving by 2%, right? Now that's probably 2% of 3 lakh rupees, 5 lakh rupees, right? So that's, again, this is a general consciousness, general opinion that has been built because of various reasons. That is the poor who is stealing. The rich are doing a great job. Honestly speaking, before the privatization happened, electricity, aggregated technical and commercial losses in Delhi was 60%, right? 60% in Delhi. And bulk of that losses were happening in the industrial setups that were within Delhi, right? So again, that's a bias again, that the educated and rich doesn't steal, and it's the poor who are are a strain on our resources. There are other issues related to it. There's an issue of subsidies, right? Often there's a common understanding that it's the poor getting subsidized. We are paying the taxes. That is wrong. In Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy and IIST did a detailed study in Jharkhand, I believe, where they objectively established that the top 25% of electricity consumers are actually getting disproportionately high electricity subsidies to the tune of 38%, and the poorest is actually getting a lot less, right? Again, as a country which after independence evolved as a socialist country, why do we have these structural inefficiencies where we are still subsidizing rich more versus the poor? And this extends across sectors, right? Let's discuss in this case study, for example, not a case study, but just a general example, right? What is your understanding of disinvestments happening in the public sector companies? General first response. Should government be owning public sector companies? Should government be in the business of business? Yes, no, maybe.
Like, for instance, when you start speaking about business, the first question comes like, are these like public good in an instance, like where, like for instance, railways is the first thing that comes to mind. How much is it actually a business per se, in the sense that like it can be debated upon, and I think that's a relevant question. Like, I don't have an answer for it, so that's why I'm just putting it up for a debate. General profit making, I don't have an opinion on that per se. Like, if you're talking about businesses like which are inclined as a profit making businesses, then ideally, like
Apala, let me stop you there. I have nothing against profit making. If you're running a business, you have to make profit. Even as a not-for-profit organizations, I have to make profits to sustain myself, right? The only difference is that profit can only go to the objectives of my work. And even as let's say a PSU or a private sector entity, if you are to continue on the growth trajectory, you need to have profits, right? And yeah, so I'll just stop at that. But could I state that you are saying that there are domains where government maybe should be there, and there are others that it should not be there? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, sort of. Like, depends on the sector.
Sure. Anybody else?
Yeah, I will add something from my own experience. I was working first decade of my career in HMT, which was the public sector, and which sort of collapsed, although it is still alive. So I went and saw, recently what they are doing, and I was surprised that they are still alive. So my take is, and then when I was working in DRDO, I saw BEL flourishing very nicely because they could position themselves. So it's also a management issue, right? So BEL projected itself that they can make the radars made by DRDO in LRD. There's a lab called LRD. So
Right.
if the public sector management was successful to project themselves as strategic, so strategic means defense or some sort of, as our colleagues are telling that, it depends on the sector. So if a public sector was able to show that it is something sensitive and strategic, then they were not closed by government, at least at that point of time. Now they are telling that, okay, even, like in US, for example, we all look at US, right? So Lockheed Martin, all F-16 jets, everything, the Aeronautical Development Agency with whom I was involved, they developed the light combat aircraft, but it is taking so many years, but it is still not operational, right? So
Is
we
that
all know
Nishant?
that. Yeah. So basically,
I did my internship on that project.
okay.
2004.
So yeah, the Tejas project. So what happens here is to come to the policy point of view. The normally what people give a defense is that strategic areas should be by government, and the second point is also economic. Somebody told the example of railways, right? So can a market competitive environment support as a part of public policy the poorest of the poor? So all over the world, we have seen that if the railway ticket has to be affordable to the poorest migrant labor, then will privatization not allow that, because it will come, market forces will come in, right? So,
Right.
and once the government goes out, it becomes very difficult to re-enter, because government is very well entrenched, and railways was making reasonable profit. And then again, there is a controversy of how accounting was done, but or everybody was making fun of Lalu Prasad Yadav, but during his time, railway was running actually in profit. So if you look at environmental sustainability also, he started all this, some people may call it gimmick, but they were doing this kulhar, right? So mud-made pottery they were giving instead of plastic, which claimed to increase the employment among pottery makers. So there are a lot of things which are linked with each other, right? So those things maybe government is able to do if government runs certain sector. So the debate here is that whether it is for environmental good or public good to continue government to be in some area, even if they make a loss, but how can they make profit first of all and make it profitable? And the second thing is, what is strategic importance? Like if defense is strategic important and America can be the most powerful country in the world militarily by private sector development, so the secrecy is not an issue, strategy is not an issue. They were able to have companies like Raytheon or Lockheed Martin, which can deliver the goods, right? Not only for America, but they can even export, and US can make money. So maybe it's a good discussion point. Like just I wanted to bring some of my, the case studies up there for discussion. Maybe others can contribute now.
Right. I'll just diverse from the points that you raised a little bit, and probably come back to those. Right. I mean, failure in public sector, not just in PSUs but in general administration, also is linked to corruption and capacity. Right. So, how many of you think? Generically speaking, quite a lot of government officials are corrupt? Will anybody agree? There's no shame in it. I mean, it's a fact. We have all got away from challans, speeding challans. I have for sure have done that.
depends on the country, no? Like not all.
We're talking
country
about India.
officials-
Yes, we're talking about India. Yes, that's the general consensus, right? The corruption is one cause, one major issue in the country, and it's also why PSUs are failing. My experience has been through the network of people I'm working that private sector is equally corrupt, right? So whether you're talking about infrastructure projects, and these are not private to government interactions, right? These are private to private interactions. The people on the top who want kickbacks, why do you think have some of the I mean there's evidence of the failure of banks and NPAs that happened, but this also extends to other sectors including infrastructure, etc. I have experience in renewables where people ask for kickbacks and people at very senior positions, vice president, general managers, etc. The other issue is issue of capacity, right? We do not have, private sector attracts better talent. They foster better talent, and we have a general decline of talent and capacity within public institutions and public sector companies, right? Is that correct? Is that it's okay to make that statement?
Well, I think it's just perspective, because like you said, both private and public sector enterprises have corrupt people. And then when sir was saying that, there's initiatives by the government, I think even the private sector would have done the same thing. But then because we're in thinking, we are very traditional that there's trust in government. So like whatever mud pots or whatever they did, the same thing would have been done by the private sector player, right? So it's really, I think, just perspective or trust.
On that point, I don't think typically a private sector will think of livelihoods of, let's say, potters. That's very unlikely.
If it's important to the customer, like right now.
If it's important to the brand and if it makes a profit for them, yes, right? That's their incentive to do something, right? And the government's motivation or incentive to do something is very different, right? So the point I was making on capacity, do we not have technical capacity? Let's say if we are talking about our distribution company in Jaipur, right? I work with them a lot. So Jaipur Discom, they don't have the technical capacity? Is that the reason they are failing? Right? And will privatization solve that problem? Right? There's a big push for private sector privatization, increase private sector participation in distribution sector, right? Is capacity the issue why public sector companies often fail? It's okay to not have an opinion. Anybody?
It's possible that it could be one of the reasons, but maybe not necessarily. But just, not too sure though. Like I need to think about it.
Right, it's possible, right? Often it's assumed that people don't have the capacity. See, for me, again, this, from my understanding, the failure of public sector companies, and I'll just take the case of power sector distribution companies, has been happening at a level, in a manner where institutions have been very conscious of the failures, right? They know what is wrong, and nobody is really, done anything to correct the fundamental issues. And today, distribution companies are being pushed in a corner where they have a little option, but to eventually give into privatization. And see, the problem that happens is the one is I think somebody pointed out about the social costs and or the social security. The fundamental issue is these markets have been created with investments of the taxpayers. Billions and trillions of dollars have gone in building that infrastructure, right? And that infrastructure being built by very technically capable people. It's so that's a common misnomer that government people don't have understanding of technology, or they don't have the understanding of issues on the ground. Through my interactions with the regulator, with senior management of the distribution companies, they are very aware of the issues on the ground, whether it's related to human resource, or whether it is technical or financial and political, right? But the unfortunate reality is assets worth, again, billions of dollars are pushed, companies worth billions of dollars are pushed in a corner where right now are in debt and are privatized practically at zero cost, right? Now, does a private sector company has the risk appetite to take over the business without any assurances and the guarantees from the government? And the answer is no, it has not happened, number one. Even if you look at success of Delhi's privatization, there are very strong assurances built in for the private sector companies where the returns were practically guaranteed, right? If you look at, we have right now a surplus generation of 360 gigawatt. Since early 2000s till very recently, the private sector investments in power generation has happened on basis of an assured return on equity of about 15 to 15.5%, plus other benefits of depreciation, easy availability of land, etc., single window clearances and all that, right? And I can link it to farmers also. Farmers are striving for minimal support price, which is basically does not even guarantee the minimum wage, right? Whereas we have ensured that the growth of our sector has happened, and growth of many other sectors, be it shipping, transport, etc., has happened with assurances from the government and indirectly assurances from the taxpayer, right? And today, many of those assets in the public sector are being privatized at subnominal prices because they over the years, the inefficiencies have pushed them in a corner where they are not able to sustain themselves, right? This this is a serious concern, should be a matter of serious concern for citizens and for us also, because it creates a lot, it's likely to create a lot more issues also going forward. Number one, if privatization, for example, is going only to happen in tier 1 cities, which is the focal point of private sector investments, how is a public sector entity, let's say JVN in case, is going to ensure services to tier 2, tier 3 cities, suburban areas, rural areas, etc., right? What is the cost those consumers are going to pay? Because we like it or not, these are profit-making centers even for the public sector entity. The Chandigarh Discom, for example, has been making healthy returns for many years. Their balance sheet is positive. I can very well assure that if you segregate the balance sheet of distribution company just for Jaipur, they will also turn out to be positive. And we are intending to hand over these profit-making centers to private entities, and then making a case that the privatization is great. We are basically creating a platform where the failure is very difficult, I would say. So these are various challenges, from people to institutions to structural issues, that I think we try to, number one, get our head around, right? Develop our understanding, let alone, working in addressing these issues is a whole different challenge altogether. The multiple dimensions, the complexity of issues, I think understanding them itself is a very, very big challenge for a public policy professional, for myself, for a small institution like ours. Yes. Any questions? I think we are about time, 6:15. We can continue this discussion. Dr. Naidu, any point you would like to raise? Did I miss something you said?
Yeah, I think one of the points what I had told was, yeah, I think you replied, like I was telling about the railway. Railway was running in profit, surprisingly, at some point of time, and the defense sector is strategic. So, what is your take on that? Like, because they are hell-bent. Because I also attend some seminars organized by PhDCC Chamber of Commerce. So they have been given very definite guidelines now for privatization. So did you look at it? Like your work at BASC is more towards where the common man is affected, or also you look at?
We looked largely at energy, but let me share my opinion. Again, it's an opinion, right? Number one, I think, and I'm also drawing parallel from the dairy sector, where NDMC and Amul Cooperative is doing a fantastic job in Gujarat, and they over the years have invested heavily in R&D. And the equipment that is being sold to the sector, one of the reasons that the prices are very competitive and we have competition from China is NDMC doing R&D and providing quality equipments, right, in the Indian market also, right? If that was not there, the prices of equipment being procured from China would have been very different, right? Number two, I think public sector privatization. I have nothing against privatization. I'm being an entrepreneur myself. I think businesses, personally speaking, businesses should not be the domain of the government. I just have my concerns on how this transition is happening, and is it happening in a fair manner, right? Have we intentionally failed Discom, then have we intentionally failed BSNL and Air India? I think when I flew Air India in my first flight in 1994 or 95, I was, I think, class 1. Early 90s, sorry. The experience was excellent. Far better than Indigo and SpiceJet and other international airlines I've flown in the recent past, right? So, and I've done the same last year also. And there's a stark difference between the quality of services back then to what it has come down, right? Again, we have to understand why this failure is happening. Is it a natural course of a company? And startups also fail. Private sector entities also fail. The bigger Ambani is succeeding, where the younger Ambani is horrendously failing, right? Yeah. Throw light on the failures of PSUs. Celebrate the successes of the private sector, but we have hardly done a similar justice to the failures of the private sector. And there are case studies in power sector also. The first example, the first effort of privatization now in Odisha, for example, it was a horrible failure. Not necessarily just because of the failure of the private sector entity itself. There were governance issues also, right?
So coming to governance issue, unless others have any question, I don't know, like I have taken too much of time. So anybody else has questions, I think we should give priority to that, because we have only another 10 minutes time, right? So
there's a question posted on the chat, so I'll just read it out. If institution, it's posted by Apala, and it says, if institutions are weak, then there is more scope for inefficiency with privatization. I feel if privatization is accompanied by other reforms in the capital market and better implemented rules and regulation, then there is a possible scope for better efficiency.
Right, I agree. I mean, but the main point to note is we need to have good regulations, right? There are case studies where US also has failed in regulation, and there will be failures. And so that's where I think India's biggest weakness is. While I have nothing against the trend towards privatization, definitely we should open the markets, and government should focus more on public utilities and public good services. There is an important role of regulation that the government has to play, and it's so far it's failing horrendously. To an extent, I am very fortunate to have collaborated with few regulators, retired regulators from various other states, and some of them tried to do excellent jobs, and often found their hands bound by either the minister or somebody else, right? So our constitution, if you are aware, also separates the powers of the executive, the legislative powers, and the judicial powers. And what we have seen recently, at least in, again, my opinion, is basically sort of what do you call it? These boundaries of powers have been thinning, with the more control of the executive on the administrative and as well as the judiciary, and that sort of raises serious concerns on how are we going to regulate the private sector. The example of grievance redressal being one very small, very probably the least impact example, where we are saying that private sector entities need to come into distribution, and then private sector employees, executives will be educating whether the grievance of the consumer is right or wrong, right? So that's just one very small, insignificant example.
Thank you. And there's one more question by Mahima, and I would request Mahima to clarify this, because I could just read it out, but I think it needs a little bit of explanation. She's saying that, going back to public opinion, according to Jeremy Bentham, also he believed that public opinion is a useful check on the authority of rulers. What is your opinion on the same, and any personal experience to support or contradict it?
In my opinion, again, public opinion is a very dangerous thing. Number one, because it's very easy to have opinion, right? And the extreme case will be, the cases of mobs that we often see in news, right? People have an opinion, and and they take justice also into their hands for whatever reasons, right? It could be right or wrong. It could be an actual thief. I don't care, right? But people at that moment, in the name of crowd justice, have the common opinion that they have the right to deliver justice right then and there. But there's another struggle right now, especially in this modern age, in the internet age or in the social media age, where our opinion is being shaped, right? Somebody's taking conscious decisions to shape our opinion. Somebody's paying somebody to shape our opinions. There's a Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. I'm not sure if you've seen it. I myself have not seen it, but it definitely talks about the subject. I think we need to be extremely critically conscious of how our education has shaped our opinions, and the reason is, education shapes our opinion at an age where we don't really have the power to question what is being taught to us, nor we have the consciousness to question it, right? People can grow up in thinking into certain specific ideologies. In my personal opinion, nothing is really perfect. Communism was not perfect, socialism was not perfect, and capital markets are not perfect, right? There are challenges with all ideologies, right? And we need to be conscious of these challenges and work towards a collective goal of human development, rather than safeguarding those ideologies in particular, right? They need to evolve, right? So I hope that answers your question to some extent.
Yeah, I think it was a very good answer. And I would like to add to that. I keep telling wherever I see students and other people, like I am amazed how very intellectual and even educated people forward WhatsApp messages at a drop of a hat. And I always keep telling youngsters, and the older people, it's difficult to tell them because they are as if they are equivalent to me, then they will feel bad. But at least youngsters, we can tell that critically evaluate and find out the truth, and see whether a opinion or a public opinion, so to say, like somebody is forwarding you something. I at least avoid forwarding it to somebody without verifying the truth of that, because that has become a very big, as Simran is telling. I think it's very easy to, now there are some measures I think Facebook has taken. It's restricting the number of forwards, but still that is a very huge problem and challenge in our days, that the public opinion can be paid and it can be shaped by political and vested interests.
Right. I think just one quick. I think if I was to give an advice as a public policy practitioner, I would say that whatever you're looking at, also look at the other extreme, right, and then make a decision. And that is something you will have to force yourself. By design, we are exposed to certain kind of information. The pages I'm visiting, the chat, the work keywords I'm typing in the chat, that's exposing me to certain kind of information. The ideologies I have is exposing me to certain kind of friends, right? As public policy professionals, at least, I mean, it should applies to all citizens, but as public policy professionals, at least, we need to expose ourselves to different ideologies, different views, different perspectives before forming an opinion. And yeah. Sorry, I stopped somebody. Please go ahead.
No, I was just replying to Professor Naidu's comment. Like we were talking about biases and opinions earlier. So I was just wondering, like, you didn't touch upon it, but I was very interested if you could have, like, how, when people have biases, like the most educated people, it doesn't matter who it is. And I've seen, like, in like the most elitist of institutions, people with these biases, and they recognize their biases, but it's somehow that they're not willing to go against a certain, because like there's something known as an echo chamber, like they surround themselves with the same minded people, and they like to delve in a certain persona that they've created for themselves by having those biases, and they adhere to that. Like, and like the recent thing we saw happening in the US, like people I mean, you all know about it. So I'm just saying, like, it's a very scary world living, like, where we're living right now. And you mentioned social dilemma also, like how these institutions or methods of like how we communicate have actually formed us. Instead of making us more aware and more knowledgeable or open to ideas, we've become more closeted in the same opinions that we have per se.
Sorry, what was the last part?
No, I'm saying like ideally, like these systems of communication should have like made us more aware and more open for discussions and dialogues, but the opposite has happened somehow. Like that, like people surround themselves with the same kind of people, like people who think the same or who talk the same, because they want a certain kind of confirmation for their thinking, and like this kind of thinking then gets fueled, and we see like if you use Reddit, and Reddit led to the like creation of this guy who like killed a lot of people in the school shootings and all those things. So I'm just saying it's scary in the sense of how these social media networks work to create these kind of echo chambers.
Right. I mean, see, instruments are instruments. A knife in the hand of Sajjan, it's a common example, and a knife in the hand of a thief, right? It's an instrument. There's nothing wrong with the instrument. It's how it uses it. And I will not blame Facebook and Twitter, although they can be more responsible, more accountable. I will blame them for data privacy issues, but that's a different subject. But at the end of the day, these are instruments. These are being used for good. They're being used for bad, right? But before that, I think biases stem from individuals, and that is something often we don't realize, right? That there's a bias within me also, right? I will look at farm policy, for example, in certain way, and some friends will look at it from a different perspective, right? I care more for rights of marginals and individuals. Somebody might be coming from it's greater for the national good, whatever that means. That's a very sort of vague and virtual assumptions that go into the what's great for greatness of the nation. So yeah, we just need to be conscious, and so biases with the two institutions are not created, often not created within the institutions themselves. Again, they're stemming from people, right? There are biases within the family, there are biases within societies, and those biases are being carried to those institutions. And you'll see it all across. I mean, if you are familiar with the movement of feminism in India, which is dominated again by the elite intellectuals, they don't really care about the struggles of the Dalit women, which is very different from women in middle upper class families, right? So again, very complex, dealing with human, multiple dimensions, subconscious, unintended. A lot of those keywords can go there.
Thank you, Simran, for your time and for this very interactive session we had today. And I really hope that the students and the faculties who were a part of this session gained a lot of insights from your experience that you've shared, and also had a very productive 1.5 hours today. So once again, I would like to thank you on behalf of Center for Policy Studies and JK Lakshmipath for coming, for talking to us today about the opinions and people in public policy. So we look forward to having you over again once COVID is over, because you are in Jaipur. We can have you as a speaker in the institute. Yeah, we look forward to working together again. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Chitranjali. I think the credit for making it interactive go to all of us. So I'd like to thank all of you, especially those who are on the panel: Usha, Dyuti, Dr. Naidu, Abhijit, Apala, and Dr. Sarita, as you who have been active. Thank you so much. Yes, we're happy to engage in future also.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grover, for a very
you,
enlightening and very interactive session.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everyone.
Pleasure.
Good evening.
Bye-bye.